Tell us a little bit about career paths. That's what we're here talking about today. So how would you define a career path in today's world?
So simply, a career path is just a series of jobs that an employee might have over the lifetime of their career. I think career paths are changing with a more dynamic workforce. I think what typically used to be a career path would be, you start at your level one, you're going to move up the corporate ladder to a management position, but people aren't looking to do that anymore. They want a lot more flexibility, and they want to be able to have a lot more options when they're choosing which direction they want to go in their career.
So why would you say career paths are important? Like what makes them important to both an employee and maybe an employer?
Well, we all have heard of the Great Resignation. It's a very popular phrase right now. And I think employees these days are demanding more from their employers, and they really want to be engaged in the work they do. In order to do that, to grow and to continue their career path themselves, they have to have those opportunities where they're working. So organizations need to step up and provide those opportunities, and not just one level up or whatever. They really need to have a very strategic career path plan in order to engage their employees.
So it goes beyond just here's this level, I'm going to reach the next level, I'm an assistant, I'm going to be the account manager, and then I'm going to go up to the account supervisor, and that it's more than just that piece. It's more of
it's almost employee engagement.
Yeah.
And what we're finding is that there was a Glassdoor survey done in 2017 that showed that 73% of people leave a job in order to advance their career. So that's a lot of cost for attrition, for rehiring, and all the associated costs for that. So from an organizational perspective, you want to engage your employees, you want to retain your employees, and you want them to enjoy the work they do.
So you're saying that Glassdoor kind of percentage there or piece of information is showing that it's about career advancement, not necessarily just more money or something like that.
It's absolutely not about more money.
Okay.
People really want to grow in their career, and they need to have those opportunities. And it can't be abstract for them. It needs to be more concrete.
So how would you describe what a typical career path, like what somebody might be used to? What would be a typical career path? What does that look like now?
So I'd say typically a career path model, it includes the job roles that the person may advance to. It includes the qualifications they need in order to move to that job. It includes the developmental opportunities that are needed for them to move to that next step. And then it also includes the competencies.
When you say competencies, explain that a little bit more.
So competencies are groups or categories of skills, knowledge, and abilities that someone brings to the table, brings to the job that they have.
So if we look at that as a typical kind of career path model, but today we're talking about performance-driven career path design. So tell me a little bit about the difference there.
So what I think the advantage of using a performance-based model versus a typical competency-based model is the ease in which you can define the performance. Competencies can be really vague. We want that person to be able to solve problems. We want them to have good time management. But we don't connect those to the actual things that people do on the job. And so when we define performance using accomplishments and criteria, then we have a really crisp definition of that performance. So it becomes very easy then on both sides for the employee to know what exactly the expectations are for them to move into that next role. For the manager, it becomes really easy then for them to coach that person, train that person, evaluate that person, because the performance and what that person needs to be able to do and produce before they get to their next role is very clear and spelled out very succinctly.
So what do you mean when you say accomplishments?
So typically when we define performance, we are looking at behavior. So what do you do on your job every day? That's how we might define your performance. Instead, we want to look at the results of those behaviors and what you produce from doing those behaviors. For example, if we're talking about a sales representative, the things that they do in order to get a sale, prepare a proposal, meet with a client, so on and so forth, those are all the behaviors they do, but the end result is a signed contract. And so we can look at the signed contract and see if it meets the criteria or the standards that we're looking for. So typically with an accomplishment, it's something that's left behind. You don't need the performer there in order to evaluate it.
So does the competency side, does that go away? Is that not as important anymore, or how does that play into things?
So I think competencies are still important. I think the difference is they don't take the primary role. So the focus is really on the accomplishments. You still need to know what skills, knowledge, ability someone is going to need in order to develop and be able to produce the outputs that we've been talking about, but they're secondary to the accomplishment.
You need to understand more what the end result is than how exactly the little pieces of how they got there.
Exactly.
As long as they meet what's expected within that accomplishment, right?
Right, so you're looking at the end result. And the other thing is that if you have a team of people and they're all producing the same accomplishment, they may go about it in very different ways, but still get the same result. So what is more important to the business, the result or how they did it? It's really the result, because that's what's critical to the organization and meeting business results.
So does it not matter the process that somebody like one person does something completely different than the other as long as they get to the same result?
So that's a great question. Yes, the process and the behaviors are still important as well. And how we can utilize that part of it is to look at what's the exemplary performance. So let's say you have a team of 5 and they're all doing sales proposals, and not everyone's producing the same as maybe your exemplary performer. You might want to look at the behaviors, the tips and tricks, the tactics, however that exemplary performer does it, in order to replicate that among all of the salespeople. So yes, it is important when you want to define what the best or exemplary performance is.
So what does this process look like in designing a performance-driven career path?
So the process is pretty simple. We start by defining the different roles in the career path for the employee that we're looking at, or the job role. And so that might be 3 or 4 job roles, that might be 10 opportunities or places that they can go in the company. Once we define the career paths, we want to look at the performance for each of those roles and define that. And basically we do a job analysis and we create what I like to call a performance profile. So in the performance profile, we include what the accomplishments are, the standards for that, producing that accomplishment, the behaviors, so process, main tasks, tips and tricks and best practices. And we also want to look at the business results. So engaging employees in their job roles, when they know how they're actually helping the company and the organization grow and be successful, it helps their own engagement in their job roles. So we always include the business results as well. After we've defined the performance, then we want to look at what enables the performance. And so what I mean by that is we have our career paths, we have the defined job roles and performance profiles, but then what else do we need in our career path initiative that's going to make it successful? And so that's when we start talking about asking questions about how are we going to set expectations for the employee when they're moving into that next role. That may involve creating a guidebook that has all the main accomplishments that they produce, how they need to produce it, the standards, kind of give them a guide in all the things that they need to do on that job and what they need to produce. Then secondly, we're going to look at how are we going to provide feedback to that employee when they're on their career path journey. So they're starting to learn accomplishments in that next role. How are we going to provide feedback for them to know that they're being successful? Then we also want to look at what resources and tools do they need. Are there job aids that exist, or are there job aids that we might need to create? What are there SOPs, standard operating procedures that exist that they need to be looking at? So we might want to have those things produced as well. We also want to make sure that resources aren't always about things. They're sometimes about people. So do they need a mentor? Do we want to set up a mentoring program for these people that are moving into new roles? Then we also want to talk about pay structure. Do we want to create a pay for performance pay structure? Do we want to set up some incentives for people to move into different roles? Maybe the organization needs more engineer 3s, and right now they only have 2. They need more, and they want to encourage people to move into that role. They might set up an incentive program to encourage people into that role. So there's that part of it too. Then we want to look at the training. So how are the people going to get the skills and knowledge that they need to produce the new accomplishments? We will look and maybe create a matrix of existing training versus training that we need to develop. A lot of companies have some training, but maybe not specifically for moving into different roles. And then we also want to look at, is that person the right person for that seat? So if you're a manager and you're working with your employee and they have, let's say, 5 options that they could go to, next you might want to look at, what are the characteristics that are important for that next role. You don't want to set someone up for failure because you've put them in a role that they're not really going to be successful for. So if you define some of those things ahead of time, then it's easy for you to say, yeah, I think John would be a great fit for that role because he has these characteristics. Just like you want to look at that from the job perspective, you also want to look at the person. So does the person have the motivation to move into that role? Are those their preferences? Do they want to do that type of job? You might be pushing them into an engineer 3 role, but maybe that's not really what they want to do. Maybe they're really more into management and they want to move into a management role, and that's their preference. So looking at their preferences is also important. So it's those 3 steps, looking at the career paths, the accomplishments, and then how do we enable the performance and enable that project to be successful.
So can you give us an example of how that process has worked for an existing company that you've worked with?
Sure. So right now I'm working on a project with a accident reconstruction firm. So they have on their staff engineers who help with accident reconstruction and impact analysis and so on. So right now I'm working with their engineering team. They currently have levels 1, 2, and 3 engineers, and they're having a problem figuring out how and when to promote people to the next level. So what we've been doing is we started by actually defining the performance. I interviewed several of the engineers in the various levels, and we came up with what the major accomplishments are for engineers in general, for the whole department. Once I had that list of of accomplishments, then I was able to define the criteria and standards for those accomplishments. We identified the major tasks that were involved, connected them to the business results, and are creating job descriptions for each of the roles 1, 2, and 3. Once I did that, then I was able to have a conversation with the stakeholder. We wanted to be very deliberate about how we had the levels. So in kind of we had a virtual whiteboard in a meeting. We took sticky notes and we had all of the accomplishments on one side and we had each of the levels. And so we went through the process of strategically deciding which accomplishments it made sense for a 1, 2, and a 3 to do. So it made it really easy to define each of those roles. Once we did that, we talked about, are there any other accomplishments that aren't on this list that you want to have on here. So that's how we were able to then further distinguish a level 2 from a level 3. Once we did that, we finalized the job descriptions, finished up, created all the data, got the data for the other accomplishments that were new. And then we start talking about the career paths. So in this instance, they have engineers can go on 3 different paths: technical, expert, and manager.
Okay.
So it's a little more complex than most organizations. So once we've done that, then the next step is to figure out what supporting materials, what's going to enable the performance in this plan to work. So it involved a conversation about the things that we just talked about. And so we came up with, we need a guidebook. We need a training matrix to see what training they have and what they don't have. We decided to connect that to pay. We're going to also create some evaluations. So make it really easy for the manager to say, okay, you've completed all this. We have a checklist. You now can produce these to standard. Now you're ready. So we want to have that checklist so the manager has a very easy way to know when that person is ready to move into that next role.
And an example from the past, like a traditional mindset of how that looks like is it may have been defined by how long they've been there,
right,
how old they are, what who they know, just little things like that are much more subjective, just kind of whatever, right? It's just based on things that don't necessarily tie to the output or the end result of the accomplishment. And
we did have that was part of our conversation when we were trying to define the career paths, and what distinguishes a level 2 from a level 3. And that kept coming up. Well, they have 5 years of experience, and this person should have 10 years of experience. And I said, and then they started to get it, because they'd say, oh, yeah, well, you could have 10 years experience and not really be doing it very well. Right. So I think that's another really defining point in why this is an advantageous way to create the career path, is because it is clear, and you are going to guarantee that the performance is better.
Right. So what was it that drove them to want to talk to you, to decide that, hey, this is the direction that we need to go?
So I think the main reason is they weren't seeing the mobility from the different levels of engineers that they needed. They had several people that were engineer 2s that really should be level 3, but they didn't have a really good way of defining what that transition looks like, or what that level, when that person is ready to be moved into a level 3, how to really define that promotion. They also had someone in level 3 who was doing things that were different and really not defined by any job role. So they also were looking for a way to make sure that that person was engaged and continuing to grow in their career. Because right now they have ideas about where they want to go, but it's not really defined in any job. And so that person isn't able to get promoted, isn't able to advance in their career, because nothing exists.
There's no measurement around that.
There's no role that exists around the things that she's doing or she wants to do. So, when that happens, as we talked about before, people will leave. If the competitor has a better career path program and a way for her to see how can she advance her career, then it's a no-brainer, right?
So the fear there a little bit is a combination of lack of performance or overperforming in certain areas, maybe not in others, but also the desire for retention, which is part of the conversation here too. Is one big reason why we do career pathing, or why you do career pathing, is to help people want to stick around, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that was part of the stakeholders' fear, was that she was going to start losing people because they didn't see that clear path for their career.
So using that same example, how is that impacting the business outside of maybe just the project that you've worked on? Is that having an impact in other areas?
Absolutely. So the beautiful thing about, once you define the performance in this way, we can use that information in a lot of different ways. it can become a coaching tool. So you've defined the performance, and say you're having an issue with Joe isn't producing this particular accomplishment well. You can walk through the same steps and the enable performance questions that we were talking about, making sure, does he have the right, have we set the expectations for that role? Is he getting feedback in the way that he needs to? Does he have the tools and resources that he needs to perform his job well? So it becomes really a culture of performance in that everyone starts thinking about it in that way. So, for example, we're also doing a training project with them. We're developing training for their consultants, and where we would typically have learning objectives for that training, now we can shift those to accomplishments. And then we start to focus on the accomplishments that that person needs to be able to produce instead of just what they need to learn. So yes, they'll learn things in order to be able to produce that accomplishment, but then it ties in with the job description that we did for the engineers. And so ultimately my goal is to have job descriptions for the entire company and for them actually be thinking about the performance system that's involved in the whole organization that's going to increase their business results, increase the performance of their employees, engage their employees more in the jobs that they're doing, and hopefully they will enjoy their work more and be more engaged and want to stay with the company.
So is it that companies currently, this one or others, is it that they don't have job descriptions or not good job descriptions, or there's a better option for that? Like what's missing now that you feel like the performance mentality steps in and makes that better?
So I would say yes, most companies have job descriptions, right? We need those in order to hire people. So they typically have them, not always. I've run into places where they don't. But what happens is either the job descriptions get outdated, the jobs change, or I think the bigger thing for me is that they're defined by things that don't really tie into the performance of the person. So qualifications, years on the job, things they need to be able to do, those are all great, but they don't really tell me how that person's going to be able to perform the job. And so by making it performance-based, then we've clearly identified the things that they can produce and define the standards for that accomplishment. So for example, even in recruiting, we can use this information. If I'm interviewing someone, let's say as an instructional designer, and I say, tell me about a course that you produced, what made it good? I would be looking for the standards that they would be judging their own work on. And if they can't come up with that and they don't know why they developed a good course, then I'm going to say, oh, well, they're not really looking at that. So we can do that in recruiting. We can do that when we're talking about, the next career path that someone wants to go on, the next role that they're looking for. And
I think as you say that, I would assume probably looking at in the recruiting process or hiring process, it's probably a pleasant experience for that interviewee to hear questions that they're not used to, and for that company to be defining even in the initial part of saying, hey, we want to see where you want to go, and so you're asking some of those questions in the interview process because there are these 5 different potential places where they could go, and now they start thinking even at the very early introduction to that company what their opportunities are.
Right, so definitely having a career path structure in place is a huge advantage for recruiting, because that person will see that the company cares enough in their professional development, in their career path strategy in order for them to have a place to go, and that they take the time and they care about their employees in that way.
Not just filling a hole,
right?
Filling a spot, yeah.
Right.
So we just talked about an example with an engineering company, and that all makes sense. Is there another, for those maybe that are watching who aren't in the engineering space or something, is there another example that you might be able to reference and kind of tell us about?
Sure. So another client that we worked with was a municipality. So it was their service department, and in their service department, everyone had the same role. So it was a union shop. Everyone was a technician 2. What people in the union finally figured out is that they were losing out on maybe advancing their career or getting a pay increase because everyone was doing the same job. Technically, the name of their job was the same, but some obviously were doing better than others, and some wanted to be recognized for that. So the union decided that they wanted to create 3 levels in the service department. So we had a technician 2, a technician 1, and then a crew lead. So what we did for them, they weren't sure how they were going to go about doing that. How do we define 3 different roles from something that's now only 1?
So had they defined those, they came up with those names of those roles to define it, and then they were asking you guys to come in and help, or was that part of your process was, hey, you need this, this, and this?
They had decided that those were the 3 roles they wanted. But right now, everyone did everything. So whether they were in service, the water department, the wastewater department, or the parks and rec department, all were called technicians 2, but all did very different things.
Right.
So what we did is we came in and we interviewed the managers of these departments, and we defined the performance for each of those roles in all 4 departments. Once we did that, then we created evaluation forms, because what they really needed to do was take the employees that were in that one role and now put them in different roles based on their performance. So this one was a little different in that the main part of this project was to create the evaluation form that helped them then place people in the different levels.
So in this case, for that example, you're defining those the accomplishments that are associated with each different level in order to take a bunch of people that are kind of in the same role right now, and you'll kind of move some people up, define better roles for those that should be there, and then define where that goes from there. Specific to unions and that kind of stuff, how does that impact? Does this make a big thing for them? Are they excited about this, or does that scare them, or how does that play out in a little bit of the politics, I guess you could say, but just thinking for those again that are out there that might have to deal with a scenario where that comes up. Does that play into things at all?
I didn't hear how it impacted the employees that were I'm assuming that they were positive about it, since it would give them a very clear-cut way of defining who was doing better than others, instead of it just being arbitrary. Joe's been here 5 years, and and Sue's been here 7 years, so we're going to put her as the higher level or a crew lead, when it wasn't based on their performance. So I think from that aspect, I think most people would find that to be a more fair way to judge people's performance.
Right.
I think overall in the municipality, it was very successful in that we are now planning to do the same thing for their police and fire department. So they are seeing the benefits and want to move to that way of defining performance and job roles throughout the whole city.
So why do you think it's so important for people to do it this particular way?
For me, it was, we could do this performance-based. And most people want to be judging on performance. That's what most organizations do. I think the problem why more people don't do it, I think they don't know how. They don't have the framework. So I think when we're able to provide a framework for defining the performance in a way that's very simple and easy to use, it makes it a lot easier for people to then say, wow, that really works, and my managers will really find this to be beneficial and easy for them to use. Whereas I think, nowadays with performance management, what we do is we set these goals, but they're arbitrary, or we say we want them to develop this competency. I want you to be a better problem solver. Well, what does that look like? I mean, how do we define that? How do you know I'm doing that on the job? And a lot of those things are things that you have to observe. So unless I'm there watching you observe your job every day, how do I really know you're doing those things? And so that's really the beauty of the accomplishment-based.
Because you can see
because you can see
actual
the
end
result, right? We're really looking at the result,
Right.
and that's really what we can evaluate in a much more defined, easy way.
So what are some of the challenges that you face when going through a process with a customer like this?
So I'd say the biggest challenge is really the shift from behavior to the accomplishment. But also I think we do have some challenges when it comes to defining the standards or the criteria, because I don't think people realize that they don't set good standards. Because we'll have a conversation and we'll say, for example, with the municipality, one of their accomplishments might be a park ready to use. Okay, so we've defined that as the accomplishment, a park ready to use. Well, how do you know it's ready to use? How do you know it's ready? And what I usually will say to clients is, imagine that perfect park. You're the manager, it's the perfect park, and you're gonna walk into that park. And what are you gonna notice that makes you say, this park is ready for people? So then it becomes, oh, the trees are manicured, the grass is cut, the flower beds look neat, there's no trash in the flower beds, the dog station is clean, there's nothing laying on the ground, there's no trash on the ground. So when you have them visualize kind of that end result, I find I get the best standards and criteria. Because those are a little more abstract than someone on an assembly line with a widget. We know what the widget needs to look like. It has to be this dimension, it has to know, those are easier to define, but when something a little bit more abstract like a park with lots of factors, it was really eye-opening for them to think, oh yeah, that is how I'm going to know. And that's one of the things that I think infiltrates the organization then, because you start to then think about that. Well, how do I know it's good? Yeah, they did this, but I'm looking at this and, oh yeah, those flowers are all dead over there. So I think it becomes really easier when you shift it from that perspective for people.
So it's easy for somebody to say, I did that, I mowed the grass, I picked up the trash, but specifically defining, well, that means there is zero trash, or the grass is mowed at this level consistently, or that kind of thing.
Right, you could look at that grass and yes, they mowed it every week, but they mowed it too short, and so it's brown and burnt out in spots.
Right.
You don't want your park looking like that.
Right. So for somebody out there who this is a brand new concept to, and they like what they're hearing, but they're not quite sure where to start, what would you say to somebody who's like, this is great, I want to do this, what's the first step?
I would say the easiest way to get started doing this is to just start with one job role. I'm sure everyone and anyone that's doing this work could easily come up with one job role where they want to define that performance and what those career paths look like, and then what does that person need in order to move from their current role to another role. I think that's the easiest way to start, with just one job role. Obviously, you're going to have to define the performance for the existing job role, but then maybe just pick one move. So, they may have opportunity in the path, right? Just pick one move in the path and define that performance, and then what are all the things that need to be in place for them to move.
And we're going to have a worksheet that they can download to kind of help them through that process. That'll just get, as we talked about, there's this shift in mindset when they're going at this. And so keeping those kind of 3 points at top of mind to be able to walk them through that. And so we'll have a download that they can grab here at the end of the webinar.
Right, so I created a download that just keeps the simple process of define the performance, define the career paths, enable performance, and what those questions that you want to ask yourself, all in a simple worksheet for them to use to get started.
When somebody takes this step and has this shift and they start to go in, what do you see as kind of the best result? Like, what's the best scenario when they take this step? What does that look like? What does a perfect situation looks like when they put this stuff in place?
So one client we worked with, we were defining, they were having problems with retention. And it was very clear from their exit interviews that people were leaving because they didn't see a clear future at their organization. So we went in to help them and just kind of start their career path initiative. We started with 2 different business units and looked at kind of their entry-level role of a client service admin. So we defined the performance and did all of this. And what I noticed over time as they started to get an understanding of this new framework, that they were using it in other areas of their business. So the training manager would come into a meeting and she'd say, you know, I was talking to the sales team and the sales manager, and I was telling them about this framework and how they could start defining the performance, blah, blah, blah. So that's when I get really excited. When you see that it's starting to infiltrate everything they do. I know at Radcom that happens all the time. Now that we've been implementing, we have job descriptions that are performance-based. We've done some diagnostic performance and some new performance analysis. So we find ways to use this in everything we do. In fact, I was just in a meeting with the VP of Sales, and we were talking about a new role that we're trying to define. And I thought, oh, well, we could ask all of these enable performance questions and come up with a plan for what we need to do to define this new role and kind of pilot it. So on the fly, we were just able to ask these certain questions and then come out with a plan that we could use for this new role.
So it really is a shift. I mean, it's once it clicks,
yes.
it starts to happen, and you see opportunities to put that into place across the board.
You can't unsee it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Gotcha.